The river bends here like it has always bent, wide and indifferent, curving around the land as though holding it in place. The Mississippi does not care what happens on its banks. It only moves, carrying silt and sediment south toward the Gulf, season after season, and changed by the crimes of men or the sentences handed down in courtrooms 100 miles away. But the land it cradles, this particular stretch of rural Louisiana, 18,000 acres deep in West Feliciana Parish, carries a weight the river cannot wash away. They call it Angola. Most people who hear that name for the first time think of the African nation. And they are not wrong to make the connection. The name traces directly to the country from which enslaved people were taken and shipped across the Atlantic, packed into the holds of vessels, and delivered to this very earth. The plantation that once occupied this ground was named for its captive workforce, a practice common among Louisiana landowners of the antebellum era. The name outlasted slavery. It outlasted the men who built their fortunes on the suffering of others. It outlasted everything and became, in time, the name of something arguably worse, America's largest maximum security prison. Before there were cell blocks and guard towers and razor wire fences stretching to the horizon, there were fields. And before the fields were worked by prisoners, they were worked by the enslaved. That history is not a metaphor at Angola. It is the literal, physical foundation beneath every building, every road, every furrow turned by the plow, when men serving life sentences step into those fields at sunrise. And they do, even today. They are standing on ground that has known forced labor for nearly 2 centuries without interruption. After the Civil War ended slavery, Louisiana did what many southern states did. It found another way. The convict leasing system emerged from the wreckage of the Confederacy like a ghost that refused to leave. Black men, targeted by discriminatory policing and prosecuted under laws designed to recriminalize their freedom, were arrested in large numbers and leased out to private landowners and companies to perform the same labor slavery had demanded. The mortality rates under convict leasing were staggering. The oversight was almost non-existent. The brutality was systemic and largely unpunished. In 1901, the state of Louisiana purchased the old plantation property and established the Louisiana State Penitentiary on its grounds. The official framing was one of order and reform, the state taking control, bringing structure to the chaos of private leasing. But the reality on the ground changed very little. The labor continued. The racial composition of the workforce continued. The violence continued. What changed was ownership. The plantation had simply been converted. The machinery of exploitation transferred from private hands into public ones, and rebranded as corrections. Armed inmate trustees are men given authority over other prisoners, a practice both cost-effective and catastrophically kept order through intimidation and force. Whippings were reported. Killings happened, then disappeared into the system and were not heard from again. A national reputation grew. Angola was spoken of the way people speak of places they hope never to find themselves. It was, by the accounts of journalists, federal investigators, and the survivors who eventually told their stories, one of the most dangerous prisons in the United States. Federal intervention eventually came, forced by litigation that wound through the courts over years and decades. The findings, when the courts finally looked closely, described what many already knew: unconstitutional conditions, overcrowding, inadequate medical care, systemic violence permitted and in some cases perpetrated by the state itself. Reforms were ordered. The trustee system was dismantled. Staffing structures shifted. Change arrived not because the institution wanted it, but because the law demanded it. But here is what did not change: the land. The fields are still planted every season. The crops still grow and are harvested. The river still bends around the property's edge, indifferent and eternal. And thousands of men, most of them black, most of them serving sentences that will not end until they die, still rise before dawn and are counted and sorted and assigned to their work. The plantation became a prison, but the prison never stopped being a plantation. That is Angola's original sin, written into the soil, legible to anyone willing to read it. There is a phrase that circulates among the men who have spent time inside Angola, spoken quietly in the dormitories and whispered in the fields. It goes like this: most inmates leave in a box. It is not a metaphor. It is not gallows humor. Exactly, though it carries the dark weight of that tradition. It is simply an acknowledgement of arithmetic. When a man is sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, the math is not complicated. He will age inside these walls. He will grow sick inside these walls. He will die inside these walls. And when he does, if no family comes to claim him, he will be buried on prison grounds in a small cemetery called Point Lookout. His grave marked with a simple white cross and an identification number where a name might have been. Louisiana has, for decades, led the nation in life without parole sentencing, not merely led, dominated. The per capita rate at which Louisiana courts have sentenced people to die in prison has no close rival among American states. The reasons are layered: mandatory sentencing statutes that strip judges of discretion, a legal culture shaped by a particular understanding of justice and punishment, political pressures that made appearing tough on crime a prerequisite for re-election, and a structural indifference to the cost, human and financial, of keeping thousands of aging men locked away indefinitely. Angola is where those decisions accumulate. It is the repository of a half-century of Louisiana's harshest judgments. Walk the housing units and you will find men in their 20s and men in their 80s occupying the same institutional space. A man sentenced at 19 for a crime committed on a Tuesday in 1987 may now be in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, managing a chronic illness with medication dispensed through a prison infirmary window. He has watched younger men arrive and occasionally leave. He has watched older men carried out. The years have a texture inside Angola that they do not have on the outside. Slower in some ways, faster in others, marked not by seasons or holidays but by counts and commissary days and the slow migration of the same faces through the same corridors. Some of those faces belong to men who maintain, to this day, that they did not commit the crimes for which they were convicted. The case of the Angola Three, Robert King, Herman Wallace, and Albert Woodfox, became the most internationally known example of that claim, and of what Angola could do to a man in the name of security. Following the 1972 killing of a prison guard named Brent Miller, Wallace and Woodfox were convicted of the murder. All three men were placed in solitary confinement, not for months or years, but for decades. They spent more than 40 years in a single cell, 23 hours a day, isolated from the general population, while their lawyers and supporters argued that the convictions were flawed and the isolation itself constituted torture. Robert King's conviction was overturned in 2001. He walked out of Angola after 29 years in solitary confinement, blinking into a world that had been transformed in his absence. Herman Wallace's conviction was overturned in 2013. He was released and died 3 days later of liver cancer, a free man only in the most technical sense, the diagnosis having arrived long before the legal ruling. Albert Woodfox, whose case wound through the courts for the better part of 5 decades, finally accepted a no-contest plea to a lesser charge in 2016 and was released after more than 44 years in solitary confinement. He was 70 years old. The Angola Three became a symbol, but symbols can obscure as much as they reveal. For every case that attracted international attention, there were hundreds that did not. Men who insisted on their innocence without lawyers who would fight for them, without human rights organizations rallying to their cause, without journalists to document the irregularities in their trials. They served their sentences in the administrative machinery of a system designed not to revisit its own conclusions. Louisiana's Board of Pardons and Parole is not a forgiving body by disposition. And for those convicted of violent crimes, particularly second-degree murder, which carries a mandatory life sentence, the doors remain sealed. And yet, change arrived in fragments. The United States Supreme Court, and a series of rulings stretching across decades, began placing limits on the harshest applications of life sentencing, particularly for juveniles. The 2012 decision in Miller v. Alabama held that mandatory life without parole for minors was unconstitutional, a recognition that a child's brain is not the same instrument as an adult's, that culpability is not fixed at the moment of an act but shaped by development, circumstance, and capacity for change. Louisiana adjusted its statutes. Some men at Angola, convicted as teenagers for crimes committed before they were fully formed, became eligible to seek parole consideration after decades served. Eligibility, however, is not release. The board reviews each case individually. Victims' families appear and testify. The weight of what was done is measured against the weight of what a man has become. For some, the door opens a crack. For most, it remains closed. The cemetery at Point Lookout continues to expand quietly, a few graves each year, on a hillside overlooking the bend of the river. The crosses are identical, the numbers are sequential, the river does not stop moving, and the men inside Angola do not stop aging, and the sentence, for thousands of them, will last exactly as long as they do. Deep in Louisiana, down a long road that winds through West Feliciana Parish, sits a place of paradoxes. It's called Angola, the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Once a year, every October, a strange transformation occurs. The gates swing open, not for release, but for admission. Thousands of people drive in, park their cars in vast fields, and buy tickets like it's a county fair. They find their seats in a massive arena, and then the main event begins. They watch men, incarcerated for life, climb onto the backs of furious, bucking bulls. This is the Angola Prison Rodeo, the longest-running prison rodeo in the United States, an annual tradition since 1965. The air crackles with a unique energy, a mix of spectacle, danger, and something much harder to define. It's the thrill of watching a person risk everything for a few seconds of glory, a fleeting escape from an unending reality. For the men on the bulls, this is more than just a ride. For the bulls themselves, it means nothing at all. How do you even begin to understand an event like this? On one hand, supporters see a force for good. Alongside the rodeo, there's a bustling craft fair. Here, incarcerated men sell incredible leatherwork, detailed paintings, and handcrafted jewelry they've made throughout the year. It's one of the only ways they can earn their own money. A small taste of economic freedom in a place defined by its absence. The rodeo itself provides structure, a goal to work towards for months, and a powerful sense of accomplishment. But critics ask a much tougher question. What does it really mean to sell tickets to watch men in a maximum security prison risk devastating injuries for public entertainment? And the injuries are very real. Concussions, broken bones. It all happens when the dust settles and the crowds go home. The riders don't drive away. They walk back to their cells, back to the same life sentence that was waiting for them before the show began. Is this rehabilitation? Or is it exploitation? The answer isn't simple. Angola has always been a master of its own image, and no one understood that better than Burro Kane, the warden who ran the prison from 1995 to 2016. Kane was a force of nature, charismatic, controversial, and convinced that moral, specifically Christian, transformation was the key to managing a prison full of men with nothing left to lose. He did something unprecedented. He partnered with the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary to create a fully accredited seminary right inside the prison walls. Men serving life sentences could earn theology degrees. These graduates then became inmate ministers, providing counseling and spiritual guidance to their peers throughout the prison. During Kane's time, violence within Angola did decrease. It is hard to say if the seminary was the sole reason. Federal oversight and other reforms were also changing the prison. But Kane undeniably built a unique culture. It was a culture centered on faith and the idea that redemption wasn't just a distant hope, but a daily practice. Of course, this raised serious questions about the separation of church and state. And Kane himself left his post amid an ethics scandal, resigning without admitting any wrongdoing. But the seminary he started, it's still there. The culture he built, for all its complexities, endures. Inside Angola today, the pursuit of a different kind of life continues, even without the promise of freedom. Men earn their GEDs. They get vocational certifications in trades like carpentry and metalwork. Some even take college-level courses. They work, they create, and they write. The Angolite, the prison's in Matron magazine, has won national journalism awards for its powerful, and sometimes critical, reporting on the very institution that holds them. In a place designed to enforce silence, These men found their voices, but no matter how many degrees are earned or articles are published, you can't escape the central, heartbreaking fact of Angola. The vast majority of the men who build these new lives inside the ministers, the writers, the artists will never leave. This reality is perhaps most visible in the prison's hospice program. It's staffed in part by incarcerated volunteers. Men who have chosen to spend their remaining years caring for others who are dying in the same prison. There's a profound tenderness in these final moments, a level of humanity that the system itself often lacks. It is both beautiful and almost unbearable to witness men condemned to die in prison, choosing to ease the deaths of their fellow prisoners. On a hill overlooking the Mississippi River lies Point Lookout Cemetery. The white crosses stand in silent, uniform rows. The soil here is the same soil that was once worked by enslaved people on the plantation that gave Angola its name. It has the same soil that holds the men who died under the brutal convict leasing system that followed. It is a ground saturated with history, a history of forced labor and lives cut short. Every year, more graves are dug. And every year, the river just keeps flowing past. Angola isn't a museum piece. It's a living, breathing institution, housing thousands of men right now. Their stories began in courtrooms across the country, but they will end here, in the infirmary or in that cemetery on the hill. It's a place where the past isn't even past. The plantation and the penitentiary share the same land, and in many ways, they share the same logic. A man goes in, time passes, he doesn't come back out. That is the fundamental truth of Angola. That is what it has always been. And until the laws change, until the sentences change, and until we as a society find a different answer to what justice truly means, that is what it will remain. Thank you for watching.